On the morning of December 17, 1944, at precisely 0630, Sergeant José Mendoza Lopez occupied a defensive position behind his Browning machine gun on the right flank of Company K. Through the dense fog approximately 200 yards east of Crinkled, Belgium, he observed German muzzle flashes erupting with alarming frequency. At 33 years of age, with 6 months of continuous combat experience, Lopez found himself in an increasingly dire situation, as every other machine gun team within the company had already been killed or wounded. The 12th SS Panzer Division had launched a massive assault, deploying approximately 300 infantry soldiers, supported by at least 4 Tiger tanks that were crashing through the forest toward American positions with devastating force. Lopez had been awake for 18 consecutive hours by this point. The ground beneath his position had frozen completely solid, making entrenchment nearly impossible. The fog hanging over Crinkled was so extraordinarily thick that visibility to the tree line where German panzer grenadiers were assembling for their next assault was severely limited. His Browning M1919 machine gun weighed 31 pounds, with the tripod adding an additional 14 pounds and the ammunition belts draped across his shoulders contributing another 20 pounds. This created a total equipment load of 65 pounds that under normal circumstances required a 5-man crew to move and operate with any effectiveness. Lopez was operating entirely alone. Company K had arrived at Crinkled 3 days prior as part of the 2nd Infantry Division's defense of the Elsenborn Ridge. The division had been engaged in continuous combat since June 7th at Normandy, where Lopez had sustained a wound when a German bullet ricocheted off his ammunition belt. Despite this injury, he had refused evacuation. Over the subsequent 6 months, he had witnessed dozens of friends perish in the French hedgerows and Belgian forests. While the 2nd Division was well trained and experienced in combat operations, nobody had anticipated the scale of what would hit them on December 16th. Hitler's final major offensive in the Western Theater involved 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks, with the entire 6th Panzer Army driving toward the Meuse River under orders to reach Antwerp and split the Allied armies completely in half. This massive attack caught American forces in a state of complete surprise. Inexperienced units crumbled under the assault, and even veteran divisions struggled desperately to maintain their positions. The 12th SS Panzer Corps' primary thrust stood directly in the path of the 2nd Infantry Division's primary thrust. Company K's sector covered approximately a quarter-mile of frozen forest east of Crinkled. The force consisted of 2 rifle platoons and 1 weapons platoon, totaling perhaps 80 men. German intelligence had specifically identified this exact position as a critical weak point in the American defensive line. A breakthrough at this location would leave the road to Elsenborn Ridge completely open and undefended. The company had already lost 23 men in the first 12 hours of combat, with 11 of those casualties being machine gunners. The Germans had learned to systematically target crew-served weapons first, understanding that eliminating the Brownings would cause the American defensive line to collapse into isolated rifle squads that could be overwhelmed through concentrated infantry assault supported by armor. Lopez had volunteered for the weapons platoon during his training at Camp Roberts in California. Standing only 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighing 130 pounds, training sergeants had informed him that he was too small to effectively handle a .30 caliber machine gun. He had proven them entirely wrong through his performance. At Normandy, he had kept his gun firing continuously while his assistant gunner bled to death beside him. During the Siegfried Line campaign, he had carried the weapon 3 miles through intense German artillery bombardment to reach a new defensive position. The gun had never jammed under his care, and Lopez had never quit, regardless of circumstances. However, December 17th presented an entirely different level of challenge. The German assault commenced at 05:30 with a 90-minute artillery barrage. Shells walked through the American positions in methodical patterns specifically designed to destroy foxholes and sever communication lines. When the barrage finally lifted, SS Panzer Grenadiers advanced through the fog with Tiger tanks providing direct fire support. The German tactics were executed flawlessly, applying overwhelming force at the weakest point in the defensive line. Company K's left flank began to buckle at 06:15. Lopez heard the deteriorating situation before he could see it through the fog. The distinctive crack of German Mauser rifles mixed with the slower, heavier thump of American M1 Garands. Screaming in both German and English made it impossible to distinguish friend from foe through the fog and snow. Then he heard the sound that made every infantryman's blood freeze, the grinding of tank treads from multiple vehicles moving at high speed. The left flank was collapsing rapidly. German infantry were pouring through the gap in overwhelming numbers. If they achieved a complete breakthrough, Company K would be surrounded and destroyed. The road to Crinkled would stand completely open, and the entire 2nd Division defensive line would be fatally compromised. Lopez assessed his situation quickly. He looked at his Browning, then toward the left flank 400 yards away across open ground. Company K's commander had positioned him on the right flank specifically because German reconnaissance had been most active in that area. Moving his position would leave the right flank completely exposed, but the left flank was already being destroyed, and Lopez was the only machine gunner still alive and operational. Lopez grabbed the Browning's carrying handle and yanked it off the tripod mount. The barrel remained hot from test firing earlier that morning. He slung 2 ammunition belts across his chest, grabbed the tripod with his other hand, and began running toward the sound of German voices. The distance was 400 yards across open ground with snow 18 inches deep. Fog so thick that visibility barely extended 30 feet ahead meant that every step exposed him to potential German observation. If enemy snipers spotted him crossing that gap, he would be killed before making it halfway across. He ran anyway. The Browning slammed against his hip with each step. The tripod caught repeatedly on frozen brush. Ammunition belts swung and tangled around his shoulders, threatening to trip him. His boots punched through the snow crust into softer powder underneath, making every stride an exhausting fight to maintain balance. Lopez had carried this gun before under various circumstances, but never this far, never this fast, and never alone. Behind him, the right flank sat exposed and completely unmanned. Ahead, German infantry were methodically destroying what remained of Company K's defensive line. Lopez reached a small depression approximately 50 yards behind the left flank positions at 06:42. He dropped into the shallow hole and immediately began setting up the Browning. The tripod went first. Unfold the legs, lock them into position, mount the gun, feed the belt, charge the weapon. The entire process normally required 3 men working together for 90 seconds. Lopez completed it alone in under 2 minutes. The hole offered almost no protection whatsoever. Everything from his waist upward remained exposed to enemy fire, but the position provided him with a clear field of fire across the approaches to Company K's left flank. Through the fog he could see German infantry advancing in squad-sized elements through the trees. Behind them, dark shapes moved through the fog. Armor. Lopez pressed his shoulder against the Browning stock and aimed at a group of 10 SS Panzer Grenadiers who were establishing a base of fire position near a cluster of shattered pine trees. They had not yet detected his presence, remaining focused on the American rifleman pinned down in foxholes 40 yards ahead. He squeezed the trigger. The Browning fired at a cyclic rate of 500 rounds per minute. Lopez delivered 17 bursts in 12 seconds. All 10 Germans went down. The survivors in Company K's forward positions heard the gun and immediately understood its significance. Their machine gunner had found a new firing position. They were not surrounded. Not yet. However, Lopez's muzzle flash had revealed his location. German infantry immediately began maneuvering to flank his position. Even worse, one of the Tiger tanks redirected its attention toward the source of the American machine gun fire. The Tiger I weighed 54 tons and mounted an 88mm main gun capable of destroying any American tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Against infantry in a shallow foxhole, it functioned essentially as a mobile artillery piece. The tank's commander had identified Lopez's position and was now bringing that 88mm gun to bear. Lopez ignored the tank entirely. He possessed no weapons capable of damaging it. All he could do was continue engaging the infantry that supported it. Without infantry protection, tanks became vulnerable to bazooka teams and sticky grenades. If Lopez could eliminate enough German foot soldiers, perhaps the tank would withdraw. He traversed the gun right and caught a group of 25 SS Panzer Grenadiers attempting to work around his flank. They were moving rapidly through the trees, using professional fire and maneuver tactics to close the distance. Lopez fired 3 sustained bursts. The lead elements went down immediately, and the rest scattered for cover. Company K's riflemen used this opportunity to shift their positions and consolidate their defensive line. Dead space that had been compromised 10 minutes earlier was now covered by interlocking fields of fire again. The German advance slowed. Not stopped, just slowed. Then the Tiger fired. The 88mm shell impacted the ground 6 feet from Lopez's foxhole. The concussion wave lifted him completely off his feet and threw him backward into the snow. His ears rang violently. Blood ran from his nose. He could hear nothing except a high-pitched whine that seemed to emanate from inside his skull. Lopez rolled onto his stomach and looked toward his firing position. The Browning lay on its side next to the overturned tripod. The ammunition belt was partially torn. Snow and frozen dirt covered the receiver. German infantry were already advancing toward what they believed was an unmanned gun position. They assumed he was dead. They assumed the machine gun was out of action. They assumed the left flank was open again. Lopez crawled back toward the Browning through 18 inches of snow, grabbed the gun, and started running. Lopez stumbled approximately 30 yards to the right rear before his hearing began to return. The ringing in his ears gradually resolved into the crack of rifle fire and the diesel rumble of German armor. He dropped behind a fallen oak tree and reset the Browning on its tripod. His hands shook as he cleared snow and dirt from the receiver. The gun had absorbed the full force of the concussion blast, but the mechanism still appeared intact. He cycled the bolt, which moved smoothly. The ammunition belt had torn in 2 places, but enough rounds remained linked together for sustained fire. Lopez repositioned the gun to cover the gap between Company K's center and right positions. From this new angle, he could see what the fog had previously hidden. German infantry were advancing in company strength, at least 150 SS Panzer Grenadiers moving through the forest in disciplined assault formations. 3 more Tigers followed behind them, their commanders standing in open hatches directing fire. The German tactics were textbook military doctrine: use overwhelming firepower to suppress American positions, advance infantry under cover of that fire, consolidate gains, and repeat. These tactics had worked against the French in 1940 and against the Soviets in 1941 and 1942. They were working now against Company K. American casualties continued mounting. Lopez could observe wounded men being dragged back toward Crinkled by their squad mates. Foxholes that had held 3 riflemen 30 minutes ago now held 1 or none. The defensive line was disintegrating, one position at a time. Lopez opened fire on a German squad advancing along a forest trail. 5 men went down in the first burst. The survivors dove for cover, but more infantry kept advancing. The Germans possessed both superior numbers and momentum. Company K had neither. A Tiger tank swung its turret toward Lopez's new position. He recognized the movement pattern immediately. The commander had spotted his muzzle flash and was preparing to engage. Lopez had perhaps 15 seconds before that 88mm gun fired again. He grabbed the Browning and ran. The shell impacted exactly where he had been positioned 3 seconds earlier. The explosion shattered the fallen oak and sent splinters spinning through the air like shrapnel. One piece caught Lopez across the left shoulder, tearing through his field jacket but not penetrating deeply enough to disable him. He kept moving. 50 yards farther right, Lopez found another shallow depression. He dropped into it and set up the Browning for the 3rd time in 20 minutes. His shoulders ached from carrying the gun. His lungs burned from running through deep snow at altitude. He had been operating on adrenaline and terror for so long that he had lost all track of time. Minutes blurred together. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours, but the Browning still functioned, and German infantry were still advancing. Lopez engaged targets as they appeared through the fog. A Panzer Grenadier team setting up a mortar position was eliminated. A squad attempting to flank Company K's remaining positions was destroyed. Individual soldiers running between trees were cut down. The gun fired continuously until the barrel glowed red and ammunition smoke obscured his field of vision. Company K's survivors began to understand what was happening. Their machine gunner was not dead. He was moving. Every time German pressure built against one section of the line, the Browning would suddenly open fire from an unexpected angle. The Germans could not predict where Lopez would appear next. They could not suppress a position that kept changing. However, Lopez could see what Company K's riflemen could not. While he fought on the left and center, German infantry had worked around the extreme right flank. At least 40 SS Panzer Grenadiers were moving through heavy forest toward Crinkled itself. If they reached the village, they could attack Company K from behind. The entire defensive position would collapse. Lopez looked at his ammunition supply. 3 belts remained, perhaps 750 rounds total. He had already fired more than 500 rounds in less than 30 minutes. The Browning's barrel was dangerously overheated. Army doctrine called for barrel changes after sustained fire to prevent warping and failure. Lopez had no spare barrel, no assistant gunner, and no support. He had 3 belts of ammunition and approximately 40 German infantry about to overrun Company K's rear area. Lopez pulled the Browning off its tripod for the 4th time, slung the gun over his shoulder, grabbed his remaining ammunition, and started running toward the sound of German voices in the forest behind American lines. Lopez reached the rear position at 07:05. He had covered 200 yards in 4 minutes while carrying 65 pounds of equipment through snow that reached above his knees in places. His breath came in ragged gasps. Sweat soaked through his uniform despite the freezing temperature. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest. He set up the Browning anyway. The position he had chosen was a natural bowl in the terrain approximately 75 yards behind Company K's forward foxholes. It offered clear fields of fire toward the German infiltration route, but zero protection. The ground sloped upward in front of him and downward behind. Any soldier standing in this position would be silhouetted against the snow, visible from 3 sides, and exposed to fire from multiple angles. Lopez mounted the gun on its tripod and fed in a fresh ammunition belt. His hands moved automatically through the sequence he had performed thousands of times in training and combat. Lock the belt, chamber around, disengage the safety, shoulder the stock, acquire targets. The German infantry appeared through the fog like ghosts. They were moving in a loose formation designed for speed rather than security. Their officers had clearly assessed the American defensive line as broken and demoralized. They expected minimal resistance during their flanking movement, scared riflemen abandoning positions, chaos. They did not expect a machine gun. Lopez opened fire at 70 yards range. The first burst caught a Panzer Grenadier squad leader in mid-stride. The man went down and his team scattered. Lopez traversed left and engaged the second group. 3 men dropped. The survivors dove behind trees. Lopez kept firing. The Browning's sustained rate of fire was 500 rounds per minute in short bursts, designed to preserve the barrel and conserve ammunition. Lopez ignored doctrine and held the trigger down for sustained bursts of 8 to 12 seconds. The barrel temperature climbed past operational limits. The receiver housing grew hot enough to burn exposed skin. Steam rose from melted snow that splattered against the metal. German infantry attempted to locate his position through the fog and gun smoke. Some fired blindly toward the muzzle flash. Others attempted to maneuver closer. Lopez engaged each group as they revealed themselves. A team setting up their own machine gun was destroyed before they could return fire. A rifle squad using a destroyed wagon for cover was eliminated. Individual soldiers trying to reach better firing positions were cut down. The Germans had superior numbers, but Lopez had superior position and firepower. More importantly, he had surprise. The SS Panzer Grenadiers had expected to catch American infantry from behind. Instead, they had walked into a perfectly positioned machine gun with clear fields of fire and a gunner who refused to stop shooting. 20 Germans went down in the first 90 seconds. The survivors pulled back into the tree line to reorganize. Lopez used the pause to change ammunition belts. 2 belts remained. The barrel glowed cherry red. Small parts that should have failed under this level of sustained fire somehow continued functioning. Company K's riflemen heard the Browning firing from their rear and understood immediately what Lopez had done. He had identified the flanking movement and positioned himself to stop it. Now he was fighting alone against what sounded like an entire German platoon. Several riflemen abandoned their forward positions and started moving back to support him. Their squad leaders ordered them to hold position. The forward line could not be abandoned, or the entire defensive situation would collapse. Lopez would have to handle the flanking force alone. The Germans reorganized faster than Lopez expected. Their officer had assessed the situation correctly. 1 American machine gun, isolated position, limited ammunition. The obvious tactical response was to fix Lopez in place with suppressing fire, while assault elements maneuvered to eliminate him. 30 SS Panzer Grenadiers opened fire simultaneously from 3 different positions. Rifle rounds snapped past Lopez's head. Bullets impacted the ground around his foxhole. Dirt and snow exploded into the air. The volume of incoming fire was overwhelming. Lopez could not return fire without exposing himself to multiple German shooters. He could not relocate without abandoning the position. He could not retreat without leaving Company K's rear completely exposed. While the suppressing fire pinned him down, 15 German infantry started a coordinated assault from 2 angles. They were moving fast, professional, and disciplined. Lopez had 90 seconds before they overran his position. He had 1 ammunition belt left, and he was completely alone. Lopez waited until the German assault elements closed to 40 yards. At that range, their supporting fire had to cease or risk hitting their own men. The suppressing fire slackened. German voices shouted commands in the fog. The assault teams prepared for their final rush. Lopez raised the Browning and fired. The first burst caught the right side assault element head-on. 5 SS Panzer Grenadiers went down before they could react. Lopez traversed left without lifting his finger from the trigger. The sustained burst walked across the left side assault team. 4 more Germans dropped. The survivors threw themselves behind any cover they could find. Lopez's sustained fire had consequences. The Browning's barrel was operating far beyond safe temperature limits. The metal had expanded from heat stress. The receiver housing glowed visibly even in daylight. Small components that should have seized or warped somehow continued functioning, but Lopez could feel the weapon's performance degrading. The bolt cycled slower, extraction became sluggish, and failures were imminent. He kept firing anyway. The Germans who had been providing suppressing fire now faced a choice: continue pinning Lopez down while their assault teams bled out in the open, or shift fire to support the survivors. They chose support. 30 rifles opened up simultaneously, trying to cover the German infantry as they pulled back to better positions. Lopez engaged targets faster than the Germans could identify his muzzle flash and return accurate fire. A Panzer Grenadier attempting to drag a wounded comrade to safety was cut down. A machine gun team trying to set up a base of fire position was destroyed before they could chamber their first round. An officer rallying his troops behind a snow-covered embankment was eliminated. The last ammunition belt ran dry at 07:12. Lopez had fired approximately 2,000 rounds in 37 minutes. He had moved positions 4 times while carrying equipment that normally required a 5-man crew. He had engaged German forces from 4 different angles, creating the illusion of multiple American machine gun teams operating in coordinated defense. The SS Panzer Grenadiers still did not know they had been fighting one man. Company K's defensive line still held, barely. Lopez pulled the smoking Browning off its tripod and looked toward Crinkled. American wounded were being evacuated through the village. Supply trucks were burning. Medics worked in the open under German artillery fire. The 2nd Infantry Division was conducting a fighting withdrawal under impossible circumstances, but they remained organized, still functional, and still in the fight because one machine gunner had bought them 37 minutes. However, Lopez's ammunition was gone. The Browning was overheated to the point of mechanical failure, and the German assault was not stopping. It was intensifying. Through the fog, Lopez could see fresh German infantry moving up to replace the casualties he had inflicted. These were not disorganized survivors. These were reinforcements, at least 60 SS Panzer Grenadiers advancing in proper assault formation with armor support. 2 Tiger tanks were maneuvering into position to provide direct fire against what remained of Company K's foxholes. American artillery attempted to interdict the German advance, but the fog made accurate fire impossible. Shells impacted randomly through the forest. Some fell among German positions. Others landed dangerously close to American lines. The artillery forward observers could not see their targets. They were firing blind, hoping to slow the enemy advance through sheer volume of high explosive. It was not working. Lopez could hear American squad leaders shouting orders to fall back. Company K had held this position for over an hour against overwhelming German pressure. They had inflicted significant casualties. They had disrupted the SS Panzer Corps' timetable, but the tactical situation was untenable. German infantry were infiltrating through gaps in the line. Tigers were bringing their main guns to bear. American ammunition was running critically low. The order came at 07:20 a.m. Company K would withdraw to secondary positions closer to Crinkled. They would conduct a fighting retreat, maintaining contact with German forces while pulling back by echelon. It was a dangerous maneuver that required discipline and courage. Lopez stood in his foxhole holding an empty machine gun and watched American riflemen start pulling back under fire. They moved in pairs, one man covering while his partner displaced, professional and controlled, but slow, too slow. German infantry saw the withdrawal beginning and immediately pressed their attack. They knew this was the moment of maximum vulnerability. If they could break the American withdrawal into a rout, Company K would be destroyed. Lopez looked at his Browning, empty, overheated, probably damaged beyond field repair, essentially useless. Then he looked at the German infantry advancing toward Company K's retreating riflemen, and he picked up the gun anyway. Lopez ran toward the position where Company K's weapons platoon had been overrun during the initial German assault. That was where the other machine gun teams had died. That was where their ammunition might still be. He reached the destroyed foxholes at 07:23 a.m. 3 dead American gunners lay where they had fallen. German infantry had already stripped them of personal items, but had not bothered with the bulky ammunition boxes. Lopez found 2 metal containers half buried in snow. Each held a 250-round belt for the Browning, 500 rounds total, enough for perhaps 6 minutes of sustained fire at combat rates. Lopez grabbed both boxes and started back toward a position that could cover Company K's withdrawal route. His shoulders burned, his back screamed. He had been carrying the Browning and its associated equipment for over 40 minutes through combat conditions. Most machine gun crews rotate carrying duties among multiple men, precisely because the physical demands were unsustainable for extended periods. Lopez had no crew to rotate with. He found a position behind a destroyed farm cart 30 yards from Company K's withdrawal axis. The cart's wooden sides had been shredded by German machine gun fire, but the metal wheel hubs provided minimal cover. Lopez set up the Browning, loaded a fresh belt, and waited. Company K's riflemen were executing their withdrawal under intense German pressure. They moved in fire teams, 3 men providing covering fire while 2 displaced backward. Then the roles reversed. It was textbook small unit tactics performed under the worst possible conditions. Fog, snow, overwhelming enemy forces, and casualties mounting with each bound backward. German infantry pressed hard. They could see the Americans retreating. They knew that if they maintained contact and kept pressure on the withdrawal, Company K would eventually break. Individual soldiers would panic. Unit cohesion would collapse. An organized retreat would become a rout. The SS Panzer Grenadiers had done this before. France 1940, Poland 1939. They knew how to exploit a retreating enemy. Apply constant pressure, never allow reorganization, pursue until complete destruction. Lopez opened fire at 80 yards range. A German squad that had been preparing to rush an isolated group of American riflemen went down. The survivors scattered. Company K's isolated team used the opportunity to fall back to their next position. Lopez traversed right and engaged another German element, 5 SS Panzer Grenadiers attempting to work around Company K's flank. 3 dropped. The others dove for cover. The American withdrawal continued.